What was meant to be a gas-led recovery
We've got to get the gas. Got to get the gas.
has become a gas-led disaster.
We've got both gas and electricity prices escalating to unprecedented levels and looking like they're going to stay there for some time.
As state and federal leaders prepare for a crisis meeting on Wednesday, Labor's flagging a change to the gas trigger, which would force companies to reserve export fuel for domestic use when prices are too high, rather than when supplies are too low.
The international price isn't determined by how much gas we have in Australia. We're now linked to the international price.
So, as one of the largest gas producers in the world, why are we paying international prices? Back in 2012, 2 years after our LNG first poured onto the global gas stage, then PM Julia Gillard ruled out keeping any aside for local use.
The Gillard government was incredibly boastful. Gas that until then had been sold cheaply in Victoria, New South Wales, South Australia, could be sent north on the pipeline to Gladstone in Queensland and sold at an international price.
Fast forward 5 years and 3 prime ministers to a strangely familiar time.
One of the factors that is driving electricity and energy prices right now is the high price of gas.
That led to the domestic gas security mechanism, but it was tied to a supply crisis, not a price crisis.
It's arisen as a result of the failure of the previous government to land an energy policy that works.
But all this is a uniquely East Coast problem. Things are very different in the West. In 2006, WA forced gas companies to reserve 15% of their supply for domestic use, and they've never had an energy issue since.
That's what a policy looks like. The problem is that we don't have a national energy policy.
If we had some form of gas reservation, like they have in WA, we'd be in a much better position than we are now.
So is the answer to Australia's gas crisis in WA, or do we need a total overhaul of the way we do energy?
Well, Economist Angela Jackson is with us now. Angela, why couldn't we just tear up some of those gas contracts and say, you know what, we really need 15% of the gas that we're sending offshore to stay here in Australia?
Well, one of the problems is it wouldn't necessarily solve the problem that we have at the moment. So if we think about the amount of gas that we're using in Australia at the moment and the pipes and the infrastructure around that, it's pretty much at capacity as is. So even if we had more gas, we couldn't necessarily use it or transport it. So it's not that situation where, you can say, well, this is the one policy that is going to solve it.
I'm no politician, but isn't it logical that we should be looking after ourselves first? And is it actually a failure of the government that we're not?
So I guess there is this question of when we opened up these gas reserves, obviously now there are contracts in place and it's something what we call sovereign risk if we just rip up those contracts. We want to make sure that internationally people can rely on Australians when we sign contracts that the government isn't going to come along and say, OK, we're going to rip that up. There is that question, though, I think, around how we plan this transition. So what we've had, I think, in Australia over the last 10 years, over the last probably 20 years, if we're fair, is a lot of uncertainty about how our energy market is transitioning to a low carbon future. The real risk here, of course, is that as we are transitioning, as we see coal coming off, we might encounter more of these situations. And we want to make sure the system is resilient enough to withstand those shocks.
We've got a brand new Labor government who've been elected to take us into the brave new world of climate change, and yet here we are running out of gas. They're under huge pressure to do something. Is pulling that trigger on the domestic gas security mechanism, isn't that the silver bullet?
Well, it's not. So I think one of the things we don't want to see is necessarily that knee-jerk reaction, right? This is a long-term problem. And of course, the government could come out and announce that, that it was going to pull that trigger tomorrow. It would do nothing to solve the problem that we're facing. So really what I hope that we do see, and what we've probably seen too much, is politics in this policy space of climate change, of energy, is to take some of that politics out and to really sit down and think about, we're facing really significant medium and long-term challenges as a country, as a globe, in fact. And we want to take the politics out of it, to sit down with level heads and really think about what that transition looks like, planning for the future, rather than responding, willy-nilly, knee-jerk reactions to crises as they emerged.
Angela, thanks for your time tonight.
Thanks, Hamish.